He was already turning around. Keys still in his hand, engine still warm. Ethan Walker stood in that parking lot and told himself he had every reason to go home. Then something stopped him. Not courage, not hope. Just the quiet, stubborn voice that said, "You drove 40 minutes, you're already here." He walked inside. And in a room full of people celebrating love, he found a woman sitting alone at the edge of everything, trying to disappear into her chair. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He just knew that the look on her face was one he recognized, because he wore it every single day. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments and give this video a like. I want to see how far this one travels. Now stay with me. This is going to be worth it. The invitation had been sitting on Ethan Walker's kitchen counter for 3 weeks. It was propped between a stack of overdue permission slips and a half-empty bottle of children's ibuprofen, and every morning when he reached past it to pour his coffee, he told himself he'd think about it later. Later came and went. And then, somehow, it was the Saturday of the wedding, and Ethan was standing in front of his bathroom mirror at 6:15 in the morning, staring at his own face like it belonged to someone he didn't fully recognize anymore. He looked tired. Not the regular kind of tired that a good night's sleep could fix, the other kind. The kind that settles into the bones after years of getting up before the sun, of working 14-hour shifts on utility poles in weather that had no business putting a man up that high, of coming home to make dinner and check homework and draw bathwater and read the same picture book 3 times because his daughter wasn't ready to sleep yet, and he would never, not once, let her hear exhaustion in his voice when she needed him to be present. That kind of tired didn't show up in bags under the eyes. It showed up in the stillness, in the way Ethan Walker had stopped looking forward to things. He knotted his tie twice before he got it right, and even then it sat crooked, and he didn't bother to fix it. His daughter, Lily, was spending the weekend with his mother out in Millhaven, about an hour east, which meant the apartment was quieter than it ever got during a normal week. Quiet in a way that should have felt like rest, but didn't. The kind of quiet that made his footsteps sound too loud, and the refrigerator hum too obvious, and the absence of cartoons on the TV at 7 in the morning feel like a missing tooth his tongue kept finding. He was 32 years old. He owned a good truck, a serviceable set of dress clothes, and a 4-year-old who still mispronounced his name as E. Fenn when she was half asleep. He had exactly nothing in his life that could be called spontaneous. The wedding was for his supervisor, Dave Hartley, 20 years in the same utility company, the man who had given Ethan every shift accommodation he'd ever needed when Lily's daycare fell through, who had once quietly slipped him a gas card when the paycheck timing was bad and never mentioned it again. Ethan owed Dave Hartley more than attendance at a Saturday afternoon wedding. He knew that. He had planned to go. He had every intention of going. He just hadn't planned on how empty the apartment would feel the night before, or how that emptiness would follow him into the morning and sit beside him through breakfast like an uninvited guest. He drove to the venue on autopilot, hands at 10 and 2, country station on low, not really hearing it. The Alderton Event Hall was out past the edge of town where the land flattened and the trees thinned, a converted barn-style building with white string lights wrapped around every visible surface and a gravel parking lot already half full when Ethan arrived at 2:40 in the afternoon. He pulled in. He found a space near the back. He turned off the engine, and then he sat there. He told himself he was giving himself a minute to mentally prepare. That was the story. But the truth, if he was being honest, and he wasn't usually, not with himself, the truth was that the moment he turned off that engine, something in his chest went very still and very quiet. And the idea of walking into a room full of people celebrating love and dancing and clinking glasses and being happy together felt like it required a version of himself that he didn't currently have access to. He was not a miserable man. He wanted to be clear about that, even in the interior dialogue he was having with no one. He loved his daughter with a ferocity that scared him sometimes. He liked his work, the physical honesty of it, the way problems up on a pole had clear solutions and you either solved them or you didn't. He had friends. Not many, but real ones. He had a life. It just wasn't a life that had room for the kind of thing that got celebrated in places like the Alderton Event Hall. His phone buzzed. A text from Dave. "Tell me you're in that parking lot, Walker." He looked up through the windshield at the front entrance, where 2 women in matching coral dresses were standing by the door greeting arrivals. He texted back, On my way in. And that was it. That was the whole decision, not some grand moment of self-realization. Just the fact that he'd told someone he was coming, and Ethan Walker did not go back on things he said. He got out of the truck. He straightened the crooked tie without a mirror. He walked inside. The ceremony had already finished by the time the cocktail hour was winding down, and the main reception hall was in that transitional phase between organized event and actual party. The DJ was testing his setup, the catering staff was ferrying out appetizer trays, and clusters of guests were arranging themselves into the social formations they'd occupy for the rest of the evening. The people who knew each other well were loud and already moving toward the bar. The people who didn't were doing what people always do at weddings when they don't know anyone. They were finding the nearest wall and pretending to check their phones. Ethan grabbed a club soda. He was driving, always driving. The only advantage of always being the responsible one was that he always had an excuse, and did a slow scan of the room for Dave. He spotted him near the head table, already surrounded, laughing at something with his neck thrown back the way Dave laughed at everything. Ethan raised his glass in the man's direction. Dave pointed 2 fingers back at him like a gun. They'd talk later. That was enough. With no immediate purpose, Ethan started moving along the perimeter of the room the way he always moved through crowded spaces. Efficiently, taking up as little room as possible, aware of where the exits were. Old habit. He'd been like this since he was a teenager, the physical awareness without the social ease. His body knew how to move through the world. His conversation had never quite caught up. He was almost to the far side of the hall when he noticed her. She was sitting alone at a round table near the back corner. Not the worst table in the room, but close. The kind of table that fills up last and empties first. There were 2 other people sitting nearby, but they were turned toward each other in conversation, and whatever bubble they were in, she wasn't part of it. She was looking at the centerpiece, not in a contemplative way, not in an I'm thinking deep thoughts way. Just looking at it. The way you look at something when you're trying to seem like you're occupied so that no one notices you're the only person at your table without anyone to talk to. Ethan knew that look. He'd worn it at enough company functions over the years to recognize it instantly, the way you recognize someone doing the same performance you've done yourself. She was somewhere around his age, maybe a year or 2 younger. She was dressed nicely. Dark blue dress, small gold earrings, hair pinned up in a way that looked like it had taken some effort. She had a glass of wine she hadn't touched much and a small evening bag on the table in front of her that she'd rearranged twice in the 30 seconds he'd been watching. He wasn't staring. He was just noticing. The way you notice things when you're already standing still and there's not much else to do. He looked away. He took a sip of his club soda. He watched the DJ finish setting up. Then he looked back at her. She'd shifted in her seat, crossed her ankles under the chair, and was now looking at the dance floor with the expression of someone watching a movie in a language they don't speak. Interested, but removed. Like the activity on the floor was for people who belonged to a different category than she did. Ethan was not, by nature, an impulsive man. He did not do things without thinking them through. He had a 3-step checklist he ran through before any major decision at work. He had a budget spreadsheet with color-coded tabs. He had never once in his adult life done something purely on instinct, without at least a brief internal review process. What he did next, he could never entirely explain. He walked over to her table. She didn't notice him approaching. She was still watching the dance floor, and he got close enough to be clearly in her peripheral vision before she turned, startled. A quick inward pull of breath, shoulders lifting slightly, the involuntary flinch of someone who hadn't expected anyone to actually walk toward them. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." "You didn't." Her voice was even, controlled, the practiced calm of someone who had learned to manage their own reactions. "I just wasn't paying attention." He stood there for one awkward beat too long, which was enough time for him to wonder what on earth he thought he was doing. And then he said, "Do you want to dance?" She blinked, just once, quickly, like she was recalibrating. "I'm sorry?" "They're about to start." He nodded toward the floor where the DJ was making some kind of announcement about the first open dance. "I'm not good at it. I should say that up front. But I figure standing on the side watching is probably worse than being bad at it in the middle." She looked at him. He couldn't quite read the expression, something between suspicion and amusement, with maybe a thin layer of what is happening underneath both of them. "Are you asking me because I look like I need rescuing?" she said. The tone was careful, not sharp, but careful. "No," he said, and he meant it. "I'm asking you because I don't want to stand at the wall by myself, and you look like you might feel the same way." She held his gaze for a moment, then something in her face shifted. Not quite a smile, more like the decision to allow the possibility of one. "Okay," she said. Her name was Mia Bennett. He found that out between the first song and the second, during the 30 seconds of awkward standing still, where neither of them was quite sure whether they were doing this or not. She offered her name like a peace offering. "I'm Mia, by the way," and he gave his back in the same spirit. "Ethan, Walker, like the Texas Ranger, but less exciting." And she laughed at that, a small surprise sound, and that was enough to get them through the opening bars. He had not exaggerated about his dancing. He was genuinely, specifically bad at it in a way that was more endearing than embarrassing. No rhythm exactly, but a lot of effort, the way a person moves when they're trying hard and know they're failing but have committed anyway. He kept time with his shoulders more than his feet, which resulted in a kind of determined bobbing that bore no technical relationship to the music. Mia was not a significantly better dancer, and she was clearly self-conscious about it, which meant she spent the first minute doing small, minimal movements that communicated, "I am here, but I am not fully committing to this." And Ethan, recognizing the energy because it was the same energy he operated in constantly, made an executive decision to be so obviously bad that she wouldn't have room to be worried about herself. He threw in an arm movement that had no business being in the same zip code as the music. She stared at him. "That's called the electrical panel," he said. "I do it at every wedding." "Do you go to a lot of weddings?" "No, but if I did, that's what I'd do." She laughed again, a real one this time, fuller, the kind that escapes before you can moderate it. And then she moved her own arms in a tentative, slightly mocking imitation of his move, and he grinned, and something about the whole absurd sequence of the last 4 minutes suddenly felt less strange. They made it through 2 songs before mutually and wordlessly agreeing to take a break. They ended up at the edge of the dance floor, slightly winded, and Mia reached up to check her hair, a reflex, an automatic check of the armor. And Ethan looked away to give her the privacy of it. "How do you know Dave?" he asked. "I don't, really. I know Karen, the bride. We were in a book club together for about a year. She moved on to a better book club, but she still invited me to the wedding, which I thought was generous." She paused. "Maybe a little pitying. I've gone back and forth on it." "She likes you," Ethan said. "People don't invite people they pity. That's too much effort for pity." Mia tilted her head slightly. "That's a very practical way to look at it." "I'm a very practical person." "Is that good or bad?" He thought about it for a second, which she seemed to find unexpected, like she'd asked a throwaway question and hadn't anticipated him actually considering it. "Depends on the day," he said. She smiled at that. Small, but genuine. "How do you know Dave?" she asked. "He's my supervisor. Been working under him for about 6 years. He took a sip of his club soda. "Good man. The kind of supervisor who remembers your kids' names and means it." "You have kids?" "One. Daughter, Lily. She's 4. He said it the way he always said it. Straightforward, no editorializing, just the fact. But the warmth that moved through the word Lily was not something he could have hidden even if he'd tried. "She's with my mom this weekend." "That must be strange. The quiet." He looked at her. Most people, when they found out about Lily, went immediately to "that must be so hard," or "you must be exhausted," both of which were true, and both of which always made him feel like an exhibit. She had not done that. She'd zeroed in on the quiet. "Yeah," he said. "It is." They stood there for a moment. The DJ had shifted into something slow, and around them people were pairing off. The room was warm from bodies and light and the particular heat that comes from a space full of people who are happy for someone. "Thank you," Mia said quietly, "for asking me to dance. You didn't have to." "I know," he said. "Most people wouldn't have." There was something underneath that sentence that she hadn't meant to leave visible. He could hear it, the unfinished edge of it, the slightly too honest observation from someone who normally kept those things better hidden. She caught herself a second after she'd said it and straightened slightly, that controlled composure sliding back into place. Ethan didn't fill the silence with reassurance. He didn't say, "Oh, I'm sure that's not true," or "Don't say that about yourself." He just let the moment be what it was, and after a second said, "I almost didn't come tonight." She looked at him. "I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes trying to talk myself out of it." "What made you come in?" "Told Dave I was on my way." He shrugged. "Can't take that back once you've said it." She was quiet for a moment. "So you're here on a technicality?" "Guess so." Something in her expression softened. Not dramatically, not in a way that rewrote her whole face, just a subtle easing around the eyes. "Me too," she said. "Karen called me at noon to confirm I was coming, and I'd already decided I wasn't going to. But then I said yes, so technicality. Technicality." He raised his club soda. She raised her mostly untouched wine. They touched glasses, which was ridiculous, and both of them knew it, and that made it somehow perfect. This small, dumb ceremony between two people who almost hadn't shown up to the same place. Atsan. The dinner seating put them at different tables, which Ethan only discovered when they finally made their way toward the place cards. He found his name at a table near the center of the room. 8 people, most of whom worked with or near Dave, and watched Mia locate hers a table away, back toward the periphery. She didn't look at him when she found it, just settled into her chair with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by the seating arrangements life handed her. Ethan sat down at his assigned table and spent the first 10 minutes of dinner making the minimum required conversation with the couple to his left while tracking, with a sideways awareness he wouldn't have admitted to, the table where Mia was sitting. She was between an older woman who appeared to be asleep adjacent and a man who was visibly more interested in his phone than in anything happening at the table. At some point during the salad course, the older woman did actually fall asleep, and Mia sat there with her wine and her dinner roll and a look of such specific, particular aloneness that Ethan set down his fork in the middle of his own conversation and thought, "This is not right." He waited until the speeches started, when movement became more normalized as people shifted to see the speakers, and then he picked up his plate and his glass and crossed to her table. He set his plate down in the empty chair beside her. She looked up, startled again, that same quick flinch. "The speeches are easier to see from here," he said. She looked at him, then at the direction of the speeches, which was actually slightly worse from her table's angle, then back at him. "Sure," she said. He sat down. The man on her other side glanced up from his phone briefly and then looked back down. The sleeping woman continued to sleep. Ethan adjusted his chair to face the front of the room and picked up his fork again, and for a minute neither of them said anything. Then Mia said quietly, so only he could hear, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "The pasta looked better from over here." She pressed her lips together. "The pasta is exactly the same." "I'm choosing to believe otherwise." She shook her head, and he could see she was trying not to smile, which she then gave up on. "You're strange," she said. "Yeah," he agreed. "Probably." The evening did what evenings do when something unexpected shifts the center of gravity. It rearranged itself around the new thing without anyone particularly noticing. Ethan and Mia talked through the main course, quietly at first, then with less self-editing as the dinner went on. They found things to talk about without trying. The pasta really was mediocre, which became a topic they held on to longer than was warranted. The DJ's song choices had a baffling internal logic that neither of them could decode. Dave's toast was 5 minutes longer than it needed to be, but genuinely moving in parts, and they both admitted that without embarrassment. She taught middle school art. She said it the way people say their jobs when they expect a reaction. A slight bracing, a waiting for the "oh, that must be so rewarding" response that never quite said anything real. Ethan said, "That sounds exhausting." She blinked. "It is. 12-year-olds are a different species. They genuinely are. They're not children anymore, but they're not teenagers yet. They're just feral and emotional, and they either love everything or hate everything, and there's no in between, and they will absolutely notice if you're having an off day and they will use it. Do you like it? Yes. She said it immediately, which told him the question had surprised her by being asked. Most days, the days where someone does something and you can see that they actually made the thing they had in their head, yeah, those days are really good. He nodded. He understood that. The satisfaction of work that resolved correctly, that matched the intention. Lineman, he said, answering the question before she asked it. Electrical. Utility company. I go up the poles. In all weather? All weather. She looked at him for a moment like she was recalibrating something. That sounds terrifying. You stop noticing after a while. The first time in ice, though, he shook his head. Your hands stop working before you realize how cold you are. That part you never fully stop noticing. How long have you been doing it? 8 years. He paused. It's good work. Predictable problems. I like that. Predictable problems, she repeated, like she was trying the phrase out. Is that what you look for in life? It was a question she asked lightly, but there was something real underneath it. A genuine curiosity, not a test. He thought about it. Used to look for other things, he said. Did the predictable problem settle in after a while? He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, which he appreciated. After dinner came more dancing, which they participated in again. 2 more songs, still badly, still with less embarrassment than the first time. The room had loosened by then, the way rooms do after dinner and a few hours of open bar, and the floor was crowded enough that no individual pair stood out. They were just 2 people among many, moving to music in a way that communicated effort, if not skill. Between songs, they stood close enough that he could hear her without raising his voice. She smelled like something clean and simple. Not a complicated perfume, just something that made the air around her a slightly better version of itself. Knock it off, he told himself. He was a practical man. He drove home that night replaying the evening in pieces, the way you do with something your mind hasn't fully filed away yet. Replaying the look on her face when he sat down at her table. The laugh she hadn't managed to suppress. The way she'd said technicality back to him. He had her number in his phone because they'd exchanged them near the end of the evening in that slightly self-conscious way that people do when they're not entirely sure what category the exchange falls into. She'd typed hers in herself, handed the phone back, and said, "In case you're ever at another wedding you don't want to be at." He'd looked at the contact name she'd put in, Mia, technicality, and he'd laughed in the parking lot alone, which was probably the most genuine thing he'd done all day. He didn't text her that night. He wasn't built for immediacy when it came to things like this. He needed to let things settle, to look at them from a practical angle, to make sure he wasn't just responding to the warmth of an unusual evening, the way a cold person responds to any available heat. But he lay awake for a while after he got home, in the quiet apartment that felt the same as it always did. And for the first time in longer than he could precisely identify, the quiet didn't feel entirely like absence. It felt like the space before something. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He was a man who needed more than one data point before he drew a conclusion. But he kept his phone on the nightstand instead of plugging it in across the room. And that was something. That was, for Ethan Walker, practically speaking, quite a lot. The text came from him 9 days later, not because he'd been waiting, or not only because of that. 9 days because work ran long on a call that had no business taking a whole week. Because Lily had a cold that turned into a week of disrupted sleep and morning daycare runs and evenings that ended the moment she went to bed. Because every time he picked up his phone to type something, he looked at the blank message field and couldn't find a way in. That didn't sound like something it wasn't, or wasn't enough like what it actually was. "Hey, it's Ethan. From the wedding. The pasta guy." He stared at it for a full minute before he sent it. Her response came in 2 minutes. "I was wondering if the pasta guy was going to appear." He typed back, "I was trying to figure out the right thing to say." "Did you figure it out?" "No. Went with pasta. Solid strategy." He sat with his phone in his hands in his kitchen, Lily asleep down the hall, the apartment quiet and ordinary and fully itself, and he was smiling at a text message like an idiot. "Can I call you sometime?" he typed. "Not tonight. She's asleep. But sometime." A pause. Not a long one. Yes, she wrote back. You can. He called her on a Thursday. He was in his truck in the utility yard, waiting for the crew lead to sort out a dispatch issue that had no urgency, and he'd called her before he'd fully decided to, which was unusual for him. She answered on the third ring, slightly breathless, like she'd walked fast to get to the phone. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. Bad time. No, I was in the supply closet sorting tempera paint and I ran, which is a sentence I didn't expect to say today. I appreciate the commitment. I also knocked over a shelf of construction paper, so that's on me. I'm sorry. She laughed. And there it was again. That same genuine, slightly surprised quality to it, like laughing was something she did when she forgot to guard against it. They talked for 22 minutes. He knew the exact time because the dispatch issue got sorted out at the 22-minute mark, and he had to go, and he noticed the number as he hung up with a vague displeasure about the interruption that he immediately told himself was disproportionate. The call had been about nothing particular. The supply closet. A difficult student she was managing. The way Lily had figured out how to climb the bookshelf and had done so 3 mornings in a row before Ethan had finally secured it to the wall. The specific quality of spring weather in their part of the state, which was currently behaving like it couldn't decide if it was still March. Nothing, and all of it. He called her again on Sunday. That one lasted an hour and 10 minutes, and he was sitting on his back steps in the cold with a jacket he'd forgotten to zip because he hadn't noticed the temperature drop. And when he finally hung up and went inside, his fingertips were cold, and he didn't especially care. The following Saturday, he asked her to coffee. The coffee shop was on Millard Street, a small place that smelled like roasted beans and old wood, and had mismatched chairs that somehow cohered into something pleasant. Mia was already there when he arrived, 5 minutes early, at the corner table, with a mug already in front of her and a book she was using as a prop, the way people use things to occupy their hands when they're nervous. She closed it when she saw him, set it face down on the table. You got here first, he said, pulling out the chair across from her. I'm always early. She said it like a mild confession. I can't help it. Nothing wrong with that. It makes people feel late when they're on time. He looked at her. I'm 2 minutes early. I know. Something in her expression shifted into something wry and warm. So we're both just very punctual and slightly anxious. Speak for yourself on the anxious part, he said, which was a lie. And she seemed to know it was a lie, which made it better somehow. He ordered a black coffee. She had some kind of latte she'd clearly already decided on before he arrived. The conversation found its level quickly, more quickly than it had any right to, given that they'd only spent one evening in each other's actual physical company. And then it went somewhere he hadn't entirely expected. She asked about Lily, not in the polite checkbox way that people asked about kids when they felt like they should, but with specific curiosity, follow-up questions, the kind of attention that indicated she was actually tracking the answer and not just waiting for the socially appropriate moment to respond. What was Lily like? Not the easy answer, she's great, she's a handful, but the real answer, what was she like? He found himself answering honestly. She's fearless in a way that terrifies me, he said. She has zero awareness of consequences. She will climb things, she will touch things, she will announce opinions in public that I would very much prefer she keep to herself. He paused. Last week she told a man at the grocery store that his cart smelled weird. She was correct, but still. Mia pressed her knuckle against her mouth, suppressing it. Was it weird? It was very weird, like old lunch meat and something else I couldn't identify. She gave up suppressing it. And what did the man do? Looked at his cart, then at me, then at Lily, and said, fair enough. She laughed outright. He watched it happen. The way her whole face changed when she laughed fully, the careful composure giving way to something that was just her, unguarded and unmanaged and lit up. He picked up his coffee. He made himself look at the table. She sounds amazing, Mia said when she'd collected herself. She's a lot, he said. But yeah. He turned the mug in his hands. She's the best thing I've ever done. A small quiet settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that comes when something real has been said. and both people are just letting it exist. What about you? He asked. Do you? He stopped himself, recalibrated. Are you close to family? She considered the question. My mom's in Phoenix. We talk once a week. She's good. She's solid. My dad's been out of the picture since I was 11, so it was mostly just her and my older brother growing up. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Marcus is in Seattle now. We're close, in the way siblings are when they live far apart. Very loyal, not great at calling. That's most siblings. Probably. She looked at the table for a second. I don't have a big life, I guess, in terms of people around. I have my students. I have a couple of close friends. I have a book club that meets once a month and mostly talks about wine. She looked back up at him. I'm not saying that like it's sad. It's just true. Okay, he said, and he meant it. Just okay. He wasn't going to tell her that her life sounded fine or that she shouldn't say it like it was sad. He was just receiving the information as given. She looked at him like that response had been unexpected. You do that thing, she said slowly. What thing? Where you don't fill space. Most people fill space. I've noticed that. It's unusual. Is it good or bad? She thought about it, which was his move thrown back at him, and he recognized it and liked it. Good, she said. Definitely good. The coffee turned into an hour. The hour turned into them walking down Millard Street in the cool spring afternoon, not going anywhere in particular, just moving in the same direction because neither of them had announced they were leaving. They stopped at a bakery window. They argued mildly about whether the croissants inside looked like they were worth the price listed on the sign. They went in and split one, standing at the counter, and it was not worth the price, but also it was, in the way that things are worth more than their face value when you're somewhere with someone you didn't expect to like as much as you do. He walked her to her car. They stood next to it for a moment, that specific pause that carries the weight of an ending that neither person wants to be the one to initiate. I'd like to do this again, he said. He was a man who said what he meant when he decided to say it. No approach patterns, no elaborate hedging, just this. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression, a brief flash of something that looked like it might be disbelief, quickly followed by a conscious decision to trust what was in front of her. Yeah, she said. Me too. He nodded. She got in her car. He walked back to his truck, and he did not look back because he was a practical man with a long drive home and every reason in the world to keep his eyes forward. But the whole drive back, and for most of the evening after, the warmth of the afternoon sat in his chest like something that had been there before he remembered it, familiar and unfamiliar all at once, like something beginning. The second date wasn't called a date. That was important to both of them, in the way that unspoken agreements are important. Not because either of them would have denied it exactly, but because naming it felt like pressure, and neither of them needed more pressure. Ethan had texted on a Tuesday evening between Lily's bath and the dishes. Lily's school does a Saturday morning art thing at the community center. She refuses to do it unless I stay. I was thinking you might want to come since you're, an art teacher. A pause, and then, no obligation. It's mostly finger painting and controlled chaos. Mia had stared at the text for a moment, then typed back, I'll bring better brushes, which was how she ended up at the Hargrove Community Center on a Saturday morning at 9:15, carrying a small canvas tote with 4 decent watercolor brushes and a block of proper watercolor paper she'd liberated from her classroom supply closet, standing in a room that smelled like glue sticks and institutional carpet while 30-some children under the age of 6 negotiated their relationship with paint. Lily Walker found her in approximately 45 seconds. She didn't come from Ethan's direction. Ethan was still signing them in at the volunteer table near the door, his back turned. She came from the middle of the room, a small person in a yellow shirt with a paint smear already on her forearm despite the fact that the activity hadn't technically started yet. And she stopped about 2 feet from Mia and looked up at her with the direct, unfiltered assessment that only very young children and very old people can get away with. You have a lot of hair, Lily said. Mia looked down at her. I do. Mine's short. Lily touched her own hair, which was pulled into two small puffs on either side of her head, the kind of hairstyle that required more coordination than it looked. Daddy does it, but he's not very good yet. He's practicing, though? He watches videos. Lily said it with a 4-year-old's complete lack of irony. Every morning, Mia was aware that something was happening in her chest that she was going to have to deal with later. That's pretty dedicated. What's dedicated? It means he tries really hard. Lily considered this. Yeah. She reached out and touched the canvas tote. What's in there? Brushes. For painting. Lily's eyes went wide, the immediate complete interest of a child who has found something relevant. Can I use one? That's kind of why I brought them. Ethan appeared at Mia's shoulder. He'd clearly heard at least the tail end of this, because he had an expression on his face that she couldn't entirely read. Something between amused and unsettled, a man watching two things he cared about unexpectedly occupy the same space. Lily, he said, you're supposed to wait at the table. I found someone, Lily said simply, as if this answered everything, which it kind of did. Ethan looked at Mia over the top of his daughter's head. Hi. Hi, she said. She's not usually this fast. I find that hard to believe. He smiled at that. A real one, not the careful diplomatic version. It changed his face when he did it, the way it always did, like something underneath the containment momentarily surfaced. They spent 2 hours in that room. Lily commandeered Mia almost immediately, installing her at their table and presenting her painting project. Some kind of house, or possibly a dragon, the line was genuinely unclear, with the gravity of a person presenting important work. Mia took it seriously. She asked real questions. What's this part? What color were you thinking for this section? And Lily answered with the concentrated certainty of someone who had a clear interior vision that simply hadn't fully made it to the paper yet, which Mia recognized from her own classroom in kids 10 years older, and it made her feel something she didn't have a clean word for. Ethan sat across from them and did his own version of the project, which was objectively worse than Lily's, and Mia told him so directly, and he accepted the assessment with the same straight-faced acknowledgement he brought to everything, which made it funnier than a more defensive response would have. This is a sky, he said, pointing to a green section of his paper. That's not what green means. I'm making an artistic choice. You're making a mistake. Lily giggled without looking up from her own paper. Daddy always makes the sky wrong. That tracks, Mia said. Ethan pointed his brush at her. Whose side are you on? I'm an art teacher. I'm on art's side. He lowered the brush. Fair. On the walk to the parking lot afterward, Lily slipped her hand into Mia's without warning or announcement, the way small children do. No ceremony, just a hand finding another hand because it seemed like the natural thing. Mia felt it and said nothing, just adjusted her grip slightly to accommodate the smallness of it. Ethan, walking on Lily's other side, saw it happen. He also said nothing. But his jaw worked once, briefly, and he looked at the sidewalk ahead of them for a moment with the expression of a man who was recalibrating something. They stood in the parking lot for a few minutes after Lily climbed into her car seat and began the elaborate process of extracting her stuffed rabbit from the bottom of the bag where it had apparently been living all morning. The late morning light was doing something nice to the ordinary concrete and chain-link landscape of the community center, which is what spring light did when it felt like it. She's great, Mia said. She meant it without reservation. She liked you, Ethan said. She doesn't do that with everyone, the hand thing. I noticed. Does that? He stopped, tried again. Is that okay? She looked at him. He was watching her with the careful attention of a man who asked very few things directly and meant every one he did. Yes, she said. It's very okay. He nodded. Once, solid, filed it. Dinner sometime, he said. Actual dinner, with a reservation and everything. She smiled. You don't have to do the reservation part. I'm going to do the reservation part. Okay. Thursday? Thursday, she agreed. He drove home with Lily asleep in the back before they'd even cleared the parking lot, the rabbit retrieved and held against her cheek, and Ethan turned the radio down low and thought about the way Lily had found Mia's hand without any prompting, without any coaching, purely on the instinct of a 4-year-old who did not overthink the things that felt right. He wished, not for the first time, that he had that particular skill. He was working on it. Dinner was Italian, small place on Carver Street that had been there since before either of them was born, checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles, and a bread basket that arrived without being asked. Mia had dressed up slightly, a wine-colored top, earrings, the careful effort of someone who had debated the level of formality and landed on more than coffee, less than a gala. And Ethan had put on a collared shirt and made sure the tie situation was not repeated. They talked for 3 hours and did not notice the time until the server came by to gently indicate that the kitchen was closing. That was the night they got into the real territory. Not the surface exchange of facts and histories, but the underneath of things. It happened gradually, the way it does when people are comfortable enough to stop performing and start actually occupying the same space. Mia told him about her first year of teaching, which had been a disaster of magnificent proportions. A class that had collectively decided to test every boundary she had, her complete failure to hold any of them, the January when she'd cried in her car every Friday for a month before figuring out that the problem wasn't the kids. It was that she'd been trying to be the teacher she thought she was supposed to be instead of the one she actually was. "What changed?" he asked. "I stopped trying to be liked," she said. Or, not stopped caring exactly, but I stopped making it the point. Once I stopped needing them to think I was cool, I could actually teach them. She turned her wine glass by the stem. Turns out 12-year-olds can smell performance from a mile away. They'll eat you alive if you're performing. Adults aren't much different. No, she said. They're just more polite about it. He told her about the 2 years after Lily was born, which were years he did not talk about in any kind of detail with anyone, and he still didn't go into full detail. Some rooms in a person take longer to open, but he said enough. That Lily's mother had left when Lily was 8 months old. Not dramatically, not with a fight, just a progressive disappearance. A woman who had realized that the life she was in was not the life she'd meant to build, and who had made a choice that Ethan could understand even when it cost him everything else. She lived in Oregon now. She called Lily on birthdays. Lily called her Cassie, because Lily barely knew the word mom had a second meaning yet. Mia listened without interrupting. When he was done, she didn't do the thing he'd come to dread from people who knew the story. The careful arrangement of their face into sympathy, the "I don't know how you do it" that was meant as a compliment and always landed as something else. She just looked at him and said, "That must have been a brutal 2 years." "It was," he said. "Simple as that. But you're still standing. Most days." "Most days counts," she said. He looked at her across the candlelight and the checkered tablecloth and the remains of a pasta dinner and thought, "You have no idea how much I needed someone to say exactly that." He didn't say that out loud. He was working on a lot of things, but he was not quite there yet. April gave way to May in the way of that particular region. A slow warm-up, mornings still cool enough for a jacket, afternoons that opened suddenly into something that felt like a promise. They fell into a rhythm that neither of them had designed. Thursday evenings, usually. Occasional Sunday afternoons, phone calls between that varied in length and randomness. Sometimes 15 minutes between her school prep and his truck time. Sometimes an hour after Lily was asleep. Sometimes a series of texts fired back and forth about nothing that constituted a conversation anyway. He brought her coffee once, to the school. Not a planned thing. He was doing a job 2 blocks over and had time to kill, and a cup he'd bought without thinking about it until he was standing outside the main office doors holding it. He left it with the receptionist with a note that said, "Only black, no sugar," from the pasta guy, and she texted him during her planning period, "You absolute weirdo." He texted back a thumbs up, which was not a satisfying response, and she called him immediately to tell him so, which was better than the text anyway. She came to his apartment the first time on a Saturday in early May. She'd offered to help him figure out a gallery wall he'd been meaning to put up in the living room since approximately before Lily was born, because he'd made the mistake of mentioning it on the phone, and she'd said, "I know how to do that," in the tone of a person who wanted to be useful and meant it. He made coffee. She stood in his living room with a collection of frames and a tape measure and the particular focused competence of a person in their element. And in 20 minutes, she had a layout taped to the wall with masking tape guides that was objectively better than anything he would have managed. You're very efficient at this, he said. I hang things for a living, she said. Well, student art, but same principle. Lily was there that day because it was a Saturday, and where else would she be? She appeared from her room approximately 4 minutes after Mia arrived, still in her pajamas, and installed herself immediately in the project. She contributed a drawing she'd done at daycare, a person with a circular body and 4 lines for limbs and enormous eyes, and insisted it go in the center of the arrangement, and Mia incorporated it without hesitation, adjusting the entire layout around the drawing, and the final result was a gallery wall anchored by a 4-year-old's kindergarten figure that somehow cohered into something that felt like a home. Ethan stood back and looked at it after the last nail went in. That's good, he said. It's really good, Mia agreed, genuinely pleased. Lily stood between them, looking at her drawing on the wall with the solemn satisfaction of an artist whose vision has been realized. The afternoon turned into dinner because Lily announced with great authority that Mia should stay for pasta, and Ethan made the simplest thing he knew how to make: olive oil and garlic, some parmesan, the pasta in whatever shape was in the cabinet. And they ate at the kitchen table with Lily doing most of the talking, reporting at length on an incident at daycare involving someone named Caleb and a disputed toy truck, presenting her case with the narrative complexity of a true crime podcast and the righteous certainty of someone who knew they'd been wronged. Mia asked follow-up questions at all the right places. She tracked the story. She said at the end, "And did you get the truck?" "For 5 minutes," Lily said, deeply unsatisfied. "That's still a win," Mia said. Lily considered this. "Okay," she said, and moved on to her noodles. Ethan washed dishes after, and Mia dried them, which was an arrangement that just materialized without discussion. And the kitchen was small enough that they were close, and neither of them moved to create more space than the room already provided. They talked quietly so as not to wake Lily, who had fallen asleep on the couch in the time it took to clear the table. It was a specific kind of quiet, the quiet of an evening that had run long in the best way, that had moved from errand to dinner to something else without anyone marking the transition. "I should go," she said eventually, not reluctantly, practically. It was past 9, and she had a drive, and he had a sleeping child. "Yeah," he said. He walked her out. The building hallway was dim and slightly too warm, the way apartment building hallways always were. And they stood at the door for that particular moment again. That pause they kept finding themselves in, the one that neither of them had yet figured out how to end the right way. She said, "This was a good day." "Yeah," he said. "It was." She looked at him for a second with an expression he couldn't entirely decode, something layered, something that had multiple things in it at once. Then she touched his arm briefly, just her hand against his forearm for a moment, and said goodnight. And he said goodnight back, and she went down the hall, and he stood at the door and listened to the stairwell door close behind her. He went back inside. He checked on Lily, still asleep, rabbit tucked under her chin. He stood in the living room for a moment and looked at the gallery wall with the drawing in the center, the figure with the enormous eyes. He thought, "I'm in trouble. Not bad trouble. Just the kind you can see coming and don't entirely try to avoid." May deepened. The calls got longer. The time between them got harder to account for at the end of the day, in the way that good things make you want more of the particular good thing. She told him about the student who'd called her drawing ugly, and the hours she'd spent afterward in the supply closet being more upset about it than she wanted to be. And he listened without minimizing it, without telling her it was just a kid, because that wasn't the point, and he knew it. He told her about the call where something had nearly gone wrong up on the pole. Not quite a close call, but close enough that he'd sat in his truck afterward for 10 minutes before he could drive. And she said, "Are you okay now?" And he said yes, and she said, "Okay. Do you want to talk about it, or do you want to talk about something else?" And he said something else, and she said, "Lily made me a card last week. Did she show you?" Seamless, just like that. Exactly what he needed. She had made him a better version of himself in the conversation sense. He was aware of this happening the way you're aware of the sun warming you through a car window. Gradually, undeniably, without being able to pinpoint the exact moment it started. He was also aware that he hadn't said anything, that there was a significant gap between what was happening in his interior life and what he'd communicated to her. and that the gap was growing wider the longer he said nothing, and that saying nothing was starting to feel less like patience and more like something that was going to cost him if he let it run too long. But he was not ready yet. That was the honest answer. He needed to be sure, not of her, but of himself, of his own steadiness. He had a daughter who had already lost one person who should have stayed, and he would not bring anyone into that child's life unless he was certain, and certainty for Ethan Walker took longer than it took for most people. And he'd made peace with that as a character trait, even when it was inconvenient. So he waited. He kept showing up. He kept being present in the specific, careful way that was the only way he knew. What he did not account for was the phone call on a Wednesday in early June. Mia picked up on the second ring, which she never did. She was usually in class mid-afternoon, and her voice was different. Not upset, not crying, just compressed, smaller than usual. "Hey," she said. "Can you talk?" "Yeah." "What's wrong?" A pause, the kind that means something. "Trevor called me," she said. The name was new. He hadn't heard it before. He waited. "My ex," she said. "We were together for almost 3 years. We broke up about 18 months ago." Another pause. "He says he wants to talk, that he's changed, and he wants to—" She stopped. He was very convincing on the phone. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He was in his truck in the utility yard again, the yard where a lot of things seemed to happen to him lately, and he watched a guy from another crew cross the lot with a thermos and didn't see any of it. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, which was honest. "That's why I called you." "What was he like? Before?" A longer pause. When she spoke again, her voice was careful. He never did anything I could point to exactly. It wasn't like that. It was more, he had a way of making me feel like I was always a little wrong, a little too much of this, a little not enough of that. And I'd tell myself I was being oversensitive because he never said anything outright, and she stopped. "I don't know. I lost a lot of ground in that relationship. It took me a long time to get it back." Ethan said nothing for a moment. "You don't have to see him," he said. "I know that. And you don't have to decide today." "I know that too." She exhaled. I needed to tell someone who would actually hear it and not just tell me what to do. I'm not going to tell you what to do." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I called you." He drove home that night slower than usual. He made Lily's dinner, did her bath, read the book, Frog and Toad, for the 18th consecutive time, because Lily had opinions about literary consistency, and sat on the edge of her bed after she went to sleep and looked at his hands in the dim light from the hall. He thought about what Mia had said, about losing ground and getting it back, about someone making her feel wrong in ways she couldn't quite point to, and convincing herself she was oversensitive. He turned those things over carefully, the way you turn over a piece of equipment when you're looking for where the damage started. He thought about what he hadn't said to her yet, and he felt for the first time the particular weight of silence that has stayed too long, the way it changes from caution into something that starts to look, from the outside, like absence. He picked up his phone. He put it back down. Not tonight. Not over the phone. Not like this. But soon. He understood now that soon had a deadline. He just had to find the right morning. Trevor Cole called again on a Friday. Mia knew it was him before she looked at the screen. She'd never deleted the number, which was its own kind of information about where she'd been 18 months ago, the person who couldn't quite close the door all the way, even when she knew she should. She let it ring twice. Then she picked up, because not picking up felt like a different kind of weakness than picking up did, and she was still figuring out which one she could live with more easily. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," he said. His voice was exactly the same. That was the first thing she noticed, and the thing that unsettled her most. She'd half expected him to sound different, to sound like the time had changed him in some audible way. He didn't. He sounded like a Tuesday evening 3 years ago, warm and easy and slightly amused, the voice of a man who had never in his life been unsure that a room was glad he was in it. "I almost didn't," she said. "But you did." Not gloating, just noting it in that particular Trevor way that was technically neutral and somehow always felt like a point on a scoreboard. "How are you, Mia?" She was standing in her kitchen. She'd been about to make tea. The kettle was on and it hadn't boiled yet, and she had the distinct sensation of being caught mid-motion, suspended between the person she'd been 2 minutes ago and whoever she was going to be by the end of this call. "I'm fine," she said. "What do you want, Trevor?" A small pause. She'd surprised him. Not the pause of a man taken off guard, but the pause of a man recalibrating, adjusting to a version of her that was further from the door than he'd expected. "I want to see you," he said. "I've been thinking about us a lot. I made mistakes, Mia, real ones, and I'm not calling to argue about who was what or who did what. I miss you. That's the honest truth." The kettle started to hiss. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said. "Just coffee. 1 hour. You can leave after 30 minutes if you want." His voice dropped slightly. Not to manipulation exactly, but to something sincere adjacent that she'd spent a long time learning to distinguish from the real thing. "I'm not asking you to forgive me over the phone. I'm asking for the chance to say what I should have said before." She turned off the kettle. She stood in her kitchen for a moment with the phone against her ear and the silence between his request and her answer filling up with 3 years of memory, not all of it bad. That was the complicated part. That it wasn't all bad. There had been good months, real ones. The difficulty of Trevor Cole was never that he was entirely wrong for her. It was that he was right enough, often enough, to make the wrong part seem like her problem. "I'll think about it," she said. That's all I'm asking." She hung up and stood at the counter and felt the specific, unpleasant sensation of her own uncertainty, like ground she'd thought was solid, showing the first hairline crack. She didn't call Ethan that night. She needed to sit with it herself first, to turn it over without the influence of anyone else's opinion, because she'd spent too many years letting other people's reads of her life override her own. She made her tea. She sat on her couch. She turned on something forgettable on television and watched it without seeing it, and thought about who she'd been when she was with Trevor, and who she was now, and whether those two people were far enough apart to matter. By 10 o'clock, she thought they probably were. By midnight, she wasn't entirely sure. "Eat," she told Ethan on Sunday. Not over the phone. He'd asked if she wanted to take a walk, a thing they'd started doing on Sunday mornings when the weather allowed. A loose circuit around the park 3 blocks from his building that took about 40 minutes and had never once been called exercise by either of them. It was just the format that fit. Moving alongside someone made certain conversations easier. You didn't have to look at each other the whole time. "He called again," she said, about 10 minutes in. Ethan kept walking. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." She looked at the path ahead. "I haven't said yes. I haven't agreed to anything." "Okay." "But I'm thinking about it," she said. "And I feel like I should tell you that because—" She stopped, reassembled. "Because we haven't put a name on what this is, and I'm aware of that, and I'm not trying to make this into something it isn't, but I also think you deserve to know." Ethan walked for a few steps in silence. This was his way. She'd learned it. The processing pause that looked like absence but wasn't. He was in there. He was working. "What's your gut telling you?" he asked. "My gut is not the most reliable narrator when it comes to Trevor." "What does your gut say about the version of yourself that was with him?" She looked at him. It was a more precise question than she'd expected. "That she was smaller," she said. "That she apologized a lot for things that weren't her fault." She paused. "That she needed to be told she was enough so often that she couldn't hear it anymore when it came." Ethan said nothing. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "And do you want to go back to that?" he asked. Quietly. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. "No," she said. Immediately, without ambiguity. "Then you already have your answer." She felt something shift in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the sensation of a thing that had been crooked for 2 days settling back into alignment. She let out a breath. "You make it sound simple," she said. "I know it isn't. I'm not saying it's simple." He glanced at her. "I'm saying you know what you want. Knowing and doing are different problems." They walked a while longer without talking, their steps falling into the rhythm they'd found over weeks of these Sunday circuits, that particular synchronization that bodies develop when they're comfortable in the same space. A dog ran past them at full tilt, trailing its leash and the muffled shouting of its owner somewhere behind. They both watched it go. "He's coming to town Thursday," Mia said. "He texted this morning." Ethan's jaw moved slightly. Did he ask if that was okay? He framed it as, he had other things to do here anyway, so it wasn't a big trip just for me. Lower stakes. The single syllable was careful, controlled. She looked at him. "You can say what you're thinking." "I'm thinking that framing it as low stakes is a way of making it harder to say no without seeming like the response is outsized." She stopped walking. He stopped too, turned slightly to face her, and there was something in his expression that she'd seen before and still hadn't entirely learned to read. That particular quality of care that he rationed carefully, that didn't spill out freely but that was very present when it appeared. "That's exactly what it is," she said. "I know," he said. "I've met people like that." "You say that like you mean more than you're saying." A pause. He looked at the path, then back at her. "I mean that the way someone frames a request tells you more about them than the request itself. If he's leading with low stakes, he's already managing your response before you've given it." He shrugged. One shoulder, understated. "That's not nothing." Mia looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the trees at an angle that made everything look slightly more defined than it was, the way certain light did. Sharp edges, clear shadows. Ethan Walker stood in it the way he stood in most things, solidly, without ornament, taking up exactly the space he occupied, and not a fraction more. "Why don't you just tell me what to do?" she said. Not a real question, an observation. "Because it's not my call." Most people would make it their call. "I'm not most people." He said it without pride, just fact. She turned and started walking again, and he fell into step beside her, and they didn't talk for a while, and it was fine. It was more than fine. It was, she thought, the thing she would miss most about Ethan Walker if she were stupid enough to let something or someone interrupt it. Not the conversations, which were good, but the spaces between the conversations, which were better. The way the silence with him never felt like she needed to fill it. She did not call Trevor back that day, but she also didn't cancel Thursday. Trevor Cole was not, in the visible sense, a threatening person. That was what made him difficult to explain to people who hadn't been inside it. He was tall and well-dressed without being showy about it, the kind of handsome that read as approachable rather than intimidating, and he had a quality of warmth that was immediate and convincing in the way of people who had learned, consciously or not, to lead with it. He laughed easily. He remembered small things, your coffee order, the name of the difficult student you'd mentioned once 3 weeks ago, the way you took your restaurant bread. He had the gift of making you feel, in his presence, like the most specific version of yourself was the version he was most interested in. It had taken Mia 2 years to understand that the specificity was surveillance, not affection. She met him at the coffee shop on Alderson Avenue, neutral ground, public space, 45-minute window that she'd already told him about up front. He was there when she arrived, standing outside rather than waiting at a table inside, which was calculated to seem considerate and probably was, on some level, while also being strategic in the way that Trevor's considerate gestures always were. He looked good. She registered this the way you register weather, factually, without the fact having particular meaning. He'd always looked good. That had never been the problem. Mia. He said her name with a warmth that was genuine enough to be indistinguishable from the real thing. He didn't try to hug her, read the room correctly on that, and held the door instead, and they went inside and ordered and found a table, and the first 10 minutes were the easiest, which she'd expected. Trevor at the beginning of things was always the most convincing version. "You look really well," he said. "Thank you." "I mean it. You seem different, in a good way." He tilted his head slightly, the analytical warmth that passed for observation. "Lighter, maybe." "Maybe," she said. He wrapped his hands around his cup. "I know I have no standing to ask this, but are you seeing someone?" She looked at him evenly. "Why would that be relevant?" "It wouldn't be," he said quickly, conceding the point. "I'm sorry. That's old habits." He paused. I genuinely just wanted to see how you were. That's the whole of it. You said you had things to say, things you should have said before. Yeah, he exhaled. I handled things badly at the end. I was critical in ways that weren't fair. I pushed you on things. He shook his head. I had this idea of what a relationship was supposed to look like. And when it didn't look that way, I made it your problem. And that wasn't right. Mia listened. She watched his face while he talked, the specific quality of his eye contact, the small movements of his hands, the way he paced the sincerity, giving it room to land. She had spent a long time unable to read any of it clearly. She was reading it clearly now, and what she was reading was real enough, not fake, not entirely calculated, just incomplete. The apology of a person who understood what they'd done wrong in the broad strokes, but had not entirely excavated the roots of why. I appreciate you saying that, she said. There's more to it than an apology, he said. I've been thinking, I'm not asking you to go back to what we were. I know that's not... He stopped, recalibrated. I'm asking if there's space for something different, something we could build differently, knowing what we know now. And there it was. She'd known it was coming. She'd told herself on the drive over that she'd known it was coming and that she was prepared for it, and she was, mostly. But she felt it anyway, the particular gravitational pull of the familiar, of the years that had been real, even when they were wrong, of the known quantity in the face of the uncertain one. She thought about Ethan, not as a counterargument, just as a fact, a point of reference. She thought about Sunday mornings, and the community center, and the gallery wall, and the dinner that turned into dishes turned into a specific, unremarkable, completely good evening. She thought about the way he'd said, I'm not most people without a single ounce of performance in it. She thought about being smaller, apologizing for things that weren't her fault, not being able to hear it anymore when it came. Trevor, she said, I think you believe what you're saying. He waited, and I think some of it is real. The regret, the recognition, I think that's real. She folded her hands on the table. But I also think we were bad for each other in a way that was specific to us. It wasn't just what you did or what I did, it was the combination. And I don't think that changes. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not devastation, but a genuine hit. The first crack in the composure. Is there someone else? He asked. She considered not answering. Then, that's not why I'm saying no. But there is. What I'm saying to you has nothing to do with anyone else, she said, and she meant it, which was the important part. I'm saying no because I remember who I was when I was with you, and I worked too hard to get back from that, to risk it. A silence. Not a hostile one. Something more complicated than that. Trevor looked at his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment in a way that felt, unexpectedly, like the most honest he'd been in the whole conversation. I did do that to you, he said quietly. Didn't I? Not on purpose, she said. But yes. He nodded, slowly. He looked like a man absorbing something he'd understood intellectually but was only now locating in his body. She left after 40 minutes, not 30. She'd given it the extra 10 because he'd been more real in those last few minutes than she'd expected, and that deserved the courtesy. She walked to her car and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, hands on the wheel, and did an interior inventory of how she felt. Not shaken, exactly. Not relieved, either. Something in between. The particular quiet of a person who has walked back into a difficult place and found that it no longer had the power over them it once did. That was good. That was real progress, even if it didn't feel triumphant. Progress rarely did. What it felt like was solid ground. She started the car and drove. She didn't tell Ethan immediately. She needed a day to let it settle. To be sure she was telling him from a steady place and not from the residual turbulence of the conversation. She texted him that evening. I met with Trevor today. I'm fine. Can we talk tomorrow? His response came in 4 minutes. Whenever you're ready. I'm here. That was it. No follow-up questions, no pressure for the immediate version, just, I'm here. She sat with her phone on her knee and looked at those 2 words for a longer time than was proportionate, aware that they were doing more work than most people would notice. They talked the next morning. She told him what had happened, plainly. The coffee shop, what Trevor had said, what she'd said back, how it had ended. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "How do you feel?" "Okay," she said. "Clear," which I wasn't expecting to feel. "Good," he said. Just that. He asked if there was someone else, she said. A beat. "What did you say?" "I said that what I was saying to him had nothing to do with anyone else." She paused. "Which is true. But it's also—" She stopped. The next sentence was sitting right there, and she wasn't quite sure she was ready to send it across the space between them. "It's also not the whole truth." The pause on his end was longer than usual. "Mia," he started. "You don't have to say anything," she said quickly. I'm not asking you for something. I just wanted to be honest about where I'm at, because I think you deserve that." Another pause. When he spoke, his voice was lower, more careful, the voice he used when he was saying something he'd thought about. "I have things to say," he said. "Things I've been—" He stopped. "Not over the phone. Can I come by this week, just to talk?" "Yes," she said. "Thursday morning, before work?" "I'll be home," she said. She hung up and stood in her apartment and felt the particular, slightly terrifying quality of something tilting toward the moment where it becomes what it actually is. She'd been living at the edge of that moment for weeks, orbiting it, aware of it without looking directly at it. Now it was Thursday morning. Now there was a conversation with coordinates. She opened her closet and looked at her clothes for a long time, which was the thing you did when what you were really doing was just trying to stay in your body for a minute. Then she closed the closet and went to make tea and tried to remember the last time she'd felt simultaneously this settled and this exposed. She couldn't. It was, she decided, probably a good sign. Or it was going to hurt. Either way, she was done running from it. The days between that phone call and Thursday had their own particular weight, the way the hours before something significant always do. Not dread exactly, but a heightened awareness of ordinary things, the way the world looks slightly more detailed when you know something is about to change its configuration. Ethan worked Tuesday and Wednesday with the particular deliberate focus of a man trying to keep himself from overthinking by keeping his hands very busy. The pole work helped. There was no room up there for interior monologue. No bandwidth for the conversation he'd been rehearsing and abandoning in pieces. Up on the pole, it was just the work. The panel, the connections, the sequence of steps that had to happen in the right order, or something broke. He'd always found that clarifying. The clarity of things that have defined right answers. What he was going to say Thursday had no defined right answer. It had only the truth, which he'd been carrying for weeks like something fragile he was afraid to set down wrong. He called his mother Tuesday night, which he did every few weeks, a habit from the early Lily years that had become a fixture. His mother, Sandra, asked about Lily first, which she always did, and he gave the report. The climbing, the Caleb truck saga, the new obsession with wanting her hair in braids that he could not yet execute reliably. His mother laughed and said she'd show him again next time she saw them. "There's someone," Ethan said into a pause. His mother was quiet for a moment, the careful quiet of a woman who had watched her son carry everything alone for a long time and had the discipline not to make too much of a first piece of news. "Tell me," she said. He told her, in the condensed, factual way he told things. The wedding, the parking lot, the dance, the months since. He told her about Lily and the hand, which he hadn't been able to talk about at the time because there was no one to tell it to. And his mother listened to that part particularly quietly. "Are you going to tell her?" Sandra asked. "Thursday." "Good. Simple as that." "What if—" "Ethan." His mother's voice was firm but not unkind. "You've been terrified of the wrong thing the whole time. You keep asking, what if it goes wrong? You should be asking, what if you wait too long?" He sat with that. "She had an ex reappear," he said. "I know," his mother said. "You told me, and she handled it." "She did." "She didn't go back." "No." "Then tell her," Sandra said. "Tell her before she thinks your silence means something it doesn't." He hung up and sat in his kitchen in the quiet, and thought about what his mother had said, about silence meaning something. He hadn't thought of it that way. His caution as communication, as a signal she might be reading as distance or disinterest or something worse. He'd been so focused on not saying the wrong thing that he hadn't considered that saying nothing was its own message. He thought about Mia sitting across from Trevor Cole in some coffee shop and holding herself steady, and coming out of it clearer than she'd gone in, and then calling him and saying it's not the whole truth with the careful honesty of a person who had decided somewhere that she was done editing herself to fit someone else's comfort. He owed her the same. He got up, rinsed his coffee cup, and went to check on Lily. She was asleep on her stomach with the rabbit on her head, which was a new configuration. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. The small shape of her, the complete, unself-conscious way she occupied the world even in sleep. And he felt the familiar weight of how much he loved her, the particular ferocity of it that still surprised him sometimes after 4 years. And under it, quieter, but just as real. The particular feeling that had been building since a parking lot and a bad dance and a croissant split at a bakery counter. The feeling he'd been patient with for months, and careful with and honest with himself about even when he hadn't been honest with her. Thursday morning, he thought. He was going to say it Thursday morning. Whatever happened after that was going to happen. He was done treating his own heart like something that needed to be protected from the risk of being known. He was at her door at 7:43 in the morning, not because he'd planned to arrive at 7:43 specifically. He'd planned for 8, had been aiming for 8, had in fact sat in his truck in the parking lot of her building for 11 minutes because he'd arrived too early and didn't want to knock on her door before she'd had reasonable time to be a person in the morning. He knew she had coffee before anything else. He knew she needed approximately 20 minutes between waking and functional. He'd picked up these pieces of information over months of phone calls and Sunday walks and dinners that ran past their intended end time, and he held them carefully, the way you hold things that matter. 7:43 because he'd run out of patience with his own waiting. He knocked twice, heard movement inside, footsteps, the small sounds of a morning apartment. And then the door opened and she was there in jeans and a light green sweatshirt with her hair only partially pinned up, the rest of it doing whatever it wanted, which was a look he'd come to associate with her being genuinely at ease. The Mia, who wasn't dressed for anything or anyone. She had a coffee mug in her hand. She'd clearly just poured it. "You're early," she said. "I know, I sat in the parking lot." She looked at him for a moment. "How long?" 11 minutes. Something in her expression shifted. Not amusement exactly, more like recognition. She stepped back from the door. "Come in." Her apartment was the way it always was on a morning like this. The curtains still half drawn against the early light, a half-graded stack of something on the coffee table, a sweater over the back of the couch that had clearly been there for days. She'd made a second cup of coffee without asking, which he saw on the kitchen counter when he followed her in, steam still rising. She handed it to him without ceremony, which was the right call. Ceremony would have made everything too formal, too loaded, before he'd even found his footing. "Sit down," she said. They sat at the kitchen table the way they'd sat at 100 surfaces by now, across from each other, close enough that it wasn't a performance of distance, far enough that neither of them was managing the nearness. He wrapped both hands around the mug. She watched him over the rim of hers. "You want to go first?" she said. "Yeah." He set the mug down. He looked at the table for a second, then made the deliberate choice to look at her instead, because he was not going to say this to the grain of a kitchen table. "I've been running this conversation in my head since February." She didn't say anything. She waited. "I'm careful," he said. "I know you know that. You've had to be patient with it, with the way I take longer to get to things than most people. And I'm aware that patience has a cost, and that I've probably been asking more of it than was fair." He paused. "I kept telling myself I was waiting until I was sure. But I was already sure. I've been sure for a while. I was just afraid of what sure meant." She set her mug down very carefully, like she was making sure her hands were steady before she let go of it. "I've been falling in love with you," he said. "Since approximately the night I watched you rearrange a small evening bag 3 times because you were nervous and didn't want anyone to see it, which, for the record, was the wedding. The first 20 minutes of the wedding." He held her gaze. "I'm not telling you this because of Trevor. I'm telling you because I've been carrying it for months, and I should have said it before now, and the only reason I didn't is the same reason I sat in a parking lot for 11 minutes today. I talked myself into waiting when I should be walking through the door. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside somewhere a car passed. The refrigerator hummed its ordinary hum. Mia was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her before. And he'd seen many versions of her face by now. The guarded version, and the laughing version, and the tired version, and the version that showed up when she thought no one was paying attention. This was different from all of them. This was a face that wasn't managing anything at all. Her eyes were bright, not crying, not quite, but the particular brightness that happens when something long held finally releases its pressure. "You absolute idiot," she said softly. He blinked. I have been waiting," she said, "since approximately the night you moved your dinner plate across a room full of people to sit next to someone you'd met 3 hours earlier because you could see she was alone." She shook her head slightly. "I have been waiting for you to say this for months, Ethan. Months, I thought. I kept thinking, maybe I'm misreading it. Maybe this is just what he's like. Maybe he's this attentive with everyone. Maybe I'm building something out of Sunday walks and phone calls that isn't what I think it is." "It's what you think it is," he said. "I know that now." Her voice was steady, but only barely. "You drove me crazy. The not saying, the being so present for everything, and then just not saying the thing. I know. She stopped. "When Trevor called, part of why it was complicated was because I was starting to think that maybe what we were doing was just..." She pressed her lips together. "And then you'd call and I'd hear your voice and I'd think, no, this is something. And then you'd still not say it, and I'd be right back in the same loop." He felt something that was not comfortable but that he deserved. The specific weight of understanding what his silence had cost her. The weeks of her doubting something she'd been right about because he hadn't found the courage to confirm it. He'd been protecting himself from uncertainty and making her uncertain instead. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's on me. I thought I was being careful. I was just being slow." "You were being you," she said. "Not an excuse, a fact. I knew who you were. I just needed you to let me know you knew too." They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the not-quite morning light. In the ordinary space of her kitchen with its half-grated papers, and the coffee going slightly cold and everything exactly as imperfect as it had always been. And Ethan felt something in his chest that he didn't have a clean mechanical word for. The unlocking of something that had been held under pressure for a long time. The particular relief of a thing finally spoken into air. "I'm not easy," he said, because she deserved the full version. "I work long hours. I have a 4-year-old who runs my life. I'm bad at talking about things until I've processed them for what is probably too long. I forget to respond to texts when I'm on a job. I'm going to make your life more complicated in some ways. Ethan, I'm giving you full disclosure. I know all of that," she said. "I've known it for months. I'm still sitting here." He looked at her. "Yeah." "Yeah," she repeated. He got up from his chair. She watched him, slightly confused, and then he came around the table and stopped in front of her, and she tilted her face up, and he held her face in both hands, careful, deliberate, the way he did everything, and kissed her once. Not dramatically, not like a movie, just finally, just here. His hands were rough from the work, and her face was soft, and it lasted about 4 seconds, and when he pulled back, she had her eyes closed for a moment and then opened them. "Okay," she said. Her voice was not entirely even. "Okay," he agreed. He sat back down. She reached across the table and took his hand, which was not a graceful maneuver. She misjudged the distance slightly, their fingers colliding before finding the right arrangement. And it was exactly right, that small ungainliness, because it was real. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "I canceled Thursday." She watched his face. "With Trevor. Before you came over. I texted him Wednesday night." "Why?" "Because I knew." She turned his hand over slightly in hers. "I knew what I wanted. I just needed to stop waiting for you to say it before I moved." A small, slightly rueful smile. "Which is also something I need to work on, apparently. not holding my own clarity hostage to someone else's timeline. That's fair, he said. We're both a work in progress. That's probably the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about me. She laughed. The real one. The one that escaped before she could moderate it. He felt it like something physical, that laugh. He thought he would never get entirely used to it, and he didn't want to. Look, the months that followed did not transform them into different people. That was the thing neither of them had expected, or maybe the thing both of them had quietly hoped for. That the naming of the thing wouldn't change the substance of it. That what they'd been building across coffee shops and parking lots and Sunday mornings would survive being called what it was. It did. It was the same, and it was more, the way a room looks different when you turn on the light but contains all the same furniture. They told Lily on a Saturday afternoon in late June. Not with ceremony, Tao. Ceremony would have been wrong, would have made a 4-year-old feel the weight of something she didn't have the context for. They told her the way you tell children things that matter, plainly, at her level, during an otherwise ordinary afternoon. They were at the kitchen table with crayons, Lily in the middle of drawing what she'd described as a horse, but which more closely resembled an aggressively circular dog. And Ethan said, "Hey, Bug, you know how Mia comes over a lot?" Lily didn't look up from her drawing. "Yeah. She's going to keep coming over, because she and we like each other. A lot. More than just being friends." Lily considered this, still focused on her drawing, added a line that may have been a tail, then looked up at Mia with the direct, unfiltered gaze she'd deployed in that community center 4 months ago. "Are you Daddy's girlfriend?" she asked. "Yes," Mia said. Lily processed this. "Okay." Looked back at her paper, added another circular element to her horse. Then, without looking up again, "Can you braid?" Mia looked at Ethan. Ethan pressed his lips together. "Yes," Mia said carefully. "I can braid." "Daddy can't," Lily said, with the specific patience of a child who has accepted an unfortunate truth about someone she loves. "I'm still learning," Ethan said. "He watches videos," Lily told Mia, "but he gets the wrong kind." "I'll show him the right kind," Mia said. Lily nodded, satisfied. The conference was apparently concluded. She returned to her horse. Ethan looked at Mia over his daughter's head. She was looking back at him with an expression he'd started to recognize as the particular look she wore when she was trying not to show how much something mattered. Her eyes were too bright, and her jaw was too steady, and she was holding on to normal with both hands. He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. She turned her palm up and took his fingers for a second. Under the table, Lily swung her feet, unconcerned, drawing her horse. It wasn't always easy. He told her it wouldn't be, and he'd been honest. There was a week in July when a job ran long and communication broke down and they had their first real argument. Not a dramatic one, nothing thrown or slammed, but a tense, uncomfortable phone call where Mia said she felt like she was constantly fitting herself into the spaces between his obligations, and he said he didn't know how to apologize for having obligations. And both of them went quiet for a while after, sitting in the particular discomfort of two people who are right about different things at the same time. She called him back 20 minutes later. "I'm not asking you to be less of a father," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said, "and I hear you about the spaces. You're not wrong. I just need to know that there's a place that's specifically for me, not just the time that's left over." He thought about that. "Thursday evenings," he said, "no matter what. That's yours, not Lily's, not Work's. Yours." She was quiet for a moment. "That's very practical. I'm a practical man. It's also actually exactly what I needed." "I know." A pause. He could hear her exhale on the other end of the line, the release of a tension she'd been holding. "We're okay?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "We're okay." They were. They kept being. Not without friction. There was friction because there always is when two people with separate histories try to build something shared, and neither Ethan nor Mia was the kind of person who let things fester without eventually naming them, which was both their best quality as individuals and sometimes the most exhausting thing about being in proximity to each other. But the friction was honest, and honest friction, they both came to understand, was infinitely preferable to the smooth surface of something being managed. Mia met Sandra in August when Ethan's mother came to stay for a long weekend. It was one of the more nerve-wracking social occasions of Mia's recent life. Not because Sandra was frightening, but because she was perceptive in the specific way of mothers who love their children clearly and don't waste time. And Mia walked into it knowing she was being known, not just met. Sandra Walker was a compact woman in her early 60s with Ethan's same economy of expression and none of his reticence about using it. She shook Mia's hand, looked at her for a moment, and said, "He talked about you for 3 months before he told me your name. I want you to know that." Mia looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the ceiling. "That's good to know," Mia said. "I thought so," Sandra said, and that was essentially the end of the evaluation. They had dinner, the four of them, Sandra producing a pot of something from Ethan's kitchen with the authority of a woman who cooked in other people's kitchens as naturally as her own. And Lily talked throughout the entire meal with the sustained velocity of a child performing for an audience she loved. And Sandra asked Mia 3 questions over the course of the evening that were so precisely targeted that Mia understood where Ethan got his ability to locate the exact center of a thing. After dinner, Sandra found her in the kitchen while Ethan was doing Lily's bath. "He doesn't do this," Sandra said. She wasn't whispering, but her voice was lower. In case that wasn't already clear. "He doesn't bring people around Lily. He doesn't call me to talk about someone. He doesn't sit in parking lots being nervous." She paused. "The last 4 years he's been very alone, very determined to make alone work." She looked at Mia evenly. "I'm not telling you this to pressure you. I'm telling you because I think you should know what it cost him to walk through a door." Mia held that for a moment. She thought about a parking lot and a man who had sat there for 11 minutes before deciding to go in. "I know," she said quietly. "He told me." Sandra looked at her for another moment, then nodded, once the same gesture Ethan made when something had been received and filed. "Good," she said, and went back to the living room. The evening of the day Sandra left, Ethan and Mia sat on the balcony of his apartment with the last of the summer light doing something good to the ordinary roofline of the neighborhood. He'd pulled out the second chair, the one that lived folded in the closet and came out for company, and they sat side by side with their feet on the railing, which was not what the railing was for, but also clearly the correct use of it. "Your mother is terrifying," Mia said. "I know. I mean that respectfully. She sees things. She's been doing it my whole life. He looked out at the roof lines. "She like you." "How can you tell?" She asked you 3 real questions. Mia considered this. "What does it mean when she doesn't like someone?" "She's very pleasant." A pause. "No questions." Mia laughed. He felt it beside him, the way he always did. The particular warmth of someone's laugh when you're close enough to feel it in the air. "She said something to me," Mia said. "In the kitchen. About you." He looked at her. "That the last 4 years you've been very alone, very determined to make alone work." She was watching his face. "Is that true?" He thought about lying. Not a serious thought, more like the reflex of a man who had spent 4 years keeping things managed, the old habit of not letting people see the full accounting. He didn't follow the reflex. "Yeah," he said. "That's accurate." "Does it feel that way now?" she asked. "Still?" He looked at the balcony. 2 chairs where there used to be one. An apartment that had Lily's drawings on the wall, her drawing anchoring the arrangement, and a coffee mug in his cabinet that was hers because she'd bought it at a garage sale and left it here, and he'd never mentioned returning it because he didn't want to. "No," he said. She reached across the space between the chairs and took his hand. He turned his palm up. They sat like that as the light went, the neighborhood going through its early evening motions below them. A dog, a kid on a bike, someone's porch radio playing something too far away to identify, but close enough to hear the fact of music. And neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything, because the quiet was full enough on its own. It had taken both of them a long time to get to a place that felt like this. There were years behind each of them that hadn't been kind. Years of the wrong kind of alone. Years of carrying more than their share. Years of having been made to feel too much or not enough. or somewhere in the difficult middle ground of never quite fitting the expectation. Those years didn't disappear. They weren't supposed to. They were part of the material that both people brought to this balcony, to this second chair, to this particular evening. But they were behind them. What was in front of them was ordinary and specific and entirely their own. The plans they were making without making a production of planning, the Saturday mornings that had become a fixture, the Thursday evenings held firm against everything, the 4-year-old asleep inside who had accepted the new shape of her world with the adaptive, unceremonious grace of a child who knew, somewhere underneath thought, that her home now had one more person in it who showed up. Mia thought about a version of herself sitting at a corner table at a wedding she'd almost skipped, rearranging a small evening bag and trying to disappear into the background. She thought about the internal conversation she'd been having with herself in those years. The one that said, "You are too much of this and not enough of that." The voice that wore Trevor's cadence even after Trevor was gone. The slow erosion of certainty that she'd spent so long trying to reverse. She thought about a man who had seen her from across a room and walked toward her anyway. She wasn't the same person who'd been sitting at that table. She was still herself. Imperfect, sometimes too much in her head, still occasionally ambushed by the old voice at low moments, but she was herself more completely than she'd been in years, more sure of the ground under her own feet. That had not come from Ethan, not exactly. It had come from herself, from the slow work of choosing better and staying with that choice. But he had been part of it. The specific way he paid attention, the particular quality of his presence, the way he made her feel like the exact person she was had been exactly who he'd meant to find. That had been part of it in a way she didn't want to minimize. She looked at him in the fading light. He was looking at the roof lines, jaw relaxed, hand warm around hers, the version of him she'd come to love best, not the competent lineman or the devoted father or any of the roles he inhabited so reliably, but just the man, present and still and genuinely here. "Hey," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you for walking into that wedding." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression, the same barely surfaced quality she'd seen on that parking lot night months ago when he'd told her he'd almost gone home. "Thank you for being at the table," he said. She smiled. He looked back at the roof lines. Inside, Lily slept. The radio played on. The second chair held its ground. September came in the way it did in that part of the country. Not dramatically, not with a single cold morning that announced the change, but gradually, the heat loosening its grip degree by degree, until one afternoon you stepped outside and the air felt different and you thought, "Oh, it's that time again." Ethan noticed it on a Tuesday, standing in the utility yard at the end of a shift, peeling off his work gloves. The sky had gone that particular shade of early fall blue that had no summer in it at all. Deeper, more certain, the kind of blue that meant something was settling in for the long run. He stood there for a moment looking at it, which was not something he'd been in the habit of doing before this year. He'd been a practical man for a long time, and practical men don't stand in parking lots looking at the sky. But something in the last several months had adjusted that instinct slightly, had made more room for the standing still, the noticing, the small, deliberate decision to look up instead of always forward. He drove home with the windows down. Mia was there when he arrived. This had become a Tuesday thing. She finished at school by 4. He was usually home by 5:30, and somewhere in the last 6 weeks they'd stopped pretending this was a scheduled arrangement and started treating it as a fact of Tuesday, the same way sunrise was a fact of morning. She was on the couch with a stack of papers and a red pen and the specific expression she wore when she was grading, concentrated and faintly resigned, the look of a person engaged in necessary work that was not, in this particular moment, her favorite thing. Lily was at the kitchen table with her crayons, manufacturing something. She looked up when the door opened with the evaluative gaze she still deployed. Even at 4, going on 5, she maintained the quality of a small person who made her assessments known. "You have paint on your ear," Lily told him. He touched his ear. There was, in fact, paint on it. He had no idea how. "Long day?" he said. "That's not where paint goes," Lily informed him. "Thank you for the feedback." Mia looked up from her grading. She took in the paint, the jacket, the end-of-day version of him that was generally a little rumpled and a lot tired, and her expression did the thing it did. The quiet opening of it, the specific warmth that was still, months in, not something he'd gotten accustomed to enough to stop noticing. "There's food," she said. "Lily and I made pasta." He stopped. "You made pasta." "She helped." He looked at Lily. "You cooked?" Lily sat up straighter. "I stirred." "That's cooking," Mia said from behind her papers. He hung up his jacket and went to the kitchen and found a pot on the stove with a lid on it and a plate set aside on the counter, which was a specific act of practical care that hit him somewhere in the chest every time because it was such a concrete, unperformed version of being thought of. Not flowers, not declarations, just a plate covered with a lid so it stayed warm. He ate standing at the counter, which he knew Mia mildly disapproved of on principle, and said nothing about in practice because she'd come to understand that the standing at the counter was not laziness. It was decompression, the physical version of the first paragraph of returning to himself after a day that required a different version. She'd asked him about it once, early on. He'd tried to explain it. She'd said okay and never mentioned it again. And the next Tuesday, there was a plate on the counter and a lid on the pot. That was the thing about her that he would never be able to fully articulate to anyone. The way she learned him, not to change him, not to accommodate him in the way that wears away at a person over years. She learned him the way you learn a place. Its patterns, its particular character, the things that required navigation, and the things that were simply its nature. And she let him be his nature, which was the rarest thing he'd ever been given by another person. He washed the plate. He went to the living room. He sat on the couch beside her, and she moved her papers slightly to make room and didn't look up. And Lily came from the kitchen and installed herself between them with the confidence of a child who had decided this was the shape of her couch. And they stayed like that. The three of them, the papers, the crayons Lily had brought without being asked, while the evening settled around the apartment like something familiar. Nothing was said for a while. It was fine. It was better than fine. It was the particular quality of life that neither of them had known was what they were looking for until they were already in the middle of it. October brought a cold snap and Lily's 5th birthday, which Mia helped plan with the organizational commitment of a woman who had been waiting for the opportunity to throw a genuinely good child's birthday party. She made lists. She consulted Lily directly and at length about the vision. The vision involved, sequentially, a dinosaur theme, then a princess theme, then a hybrid that Lily described as princess dinosaurs, and Mia said absolutely without hesitation and figured out how to execute it, which involved hand-painting small crowns onto plastic dinosaur figurines at Ethan's kitchen table on a Thursday evening, while he pretended to help and mostly handed her paint colors when she reached back without looking. "You didn't have to do all this," he said at one point. She was focused on a particularly small stegosaurus. "I know. It's a lot of work. It's fun." She glanced at him. "Do you want to try the next one?" He looked at the figurine, at the brush. "No." Smart man. He watched her work. There was something about watching Mia do something she was good at. The specific ease of a person in their element, the way the skill looked effortless even when it wasn't, that he could do for a long time without getting tired of it. She had a teacher's hands, capable and quick and used to making things out of other things. He liked those hands. He had told her so once, which had surprised her because it was not a conventional compliment. She'd looked at her hands afterward like she was seeing them differently. The party happened on a Saturday and was, by any measure, a complete success. 8 5-year-olds in a living room rearranged for maximum chaos, each one departing with a small crowned dinosaur, all of them having been loud and sticky and incandescent with the specific joy of small children at a party designed exactly for them. Lily moved through it like a small empress, magnanimous and purposeful, accepting gifts with great seriousness, and directing activities with a confidence that Ethan recognized as her mother's pragmatism wearing his daughter's face. At the end of it, when the last guest had gone and Lily was asleep on the couch, with frosting somewhere in her hair and a fist closed around the T-Rex that had been her personal favorite, Ethan and Mia sat on the floor of the living room with the remains of streamers and wrapping paper around them, both too tired to begin cleaning and both unwilling to be the one who started. "That was excellent," Mia said. "It was a lot. Worth it." He looked at his daughter asleep on the couch. The T-Rex. The frosting. The complete total abandon of her sleep, the way children sleep when they have had a perfect day. Yeah, he said. Worth it. Mia leaned her head against his shoulder. It was not a dramatic gesture, just the natural settling of a tired person toward the nearest warm thing. And he let it happen, turned his head slightly to rest it against hers, and they sat in the debris of a 5-year-old's birthday party in a quiet that felt like the best kind of full. I love her, Mia said. Not a big announcement, just a fact being named. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. She knows too. How can you tell? She told the lady at the grocery store last week that you were going to teach her to braid when she was bigger. He paused. In the same sentence as she told me Sandra's mashed potatoes were better than mine. Mia laughed. He felt it against his shoulder. She's not wrong about the mashed potatoes, Mia said. I know, he said. That one stings. Well, November arrived, and with it the particular intimacy of the darker months, the earlier evenings that push people inside, the way cold weather restructured social life into smaller, warmer spaces. Mia's apartment became their second home in the way that Ethan's had become hers, a place where Lily's drawings started appearing on the refrigerator, where a small collection of Lily-relevant supplies materialized in a basket by the door for Saturday mornings, where Ethan had a coffee mug that was specifically his in a cabinet that used to hold only things that were specifically hers. It happened without being decided. That was Mia had come to understand how the real things happened. Not announced, not negotiated, just gradually present in a way that made their absence unimaginable. She was at her school on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November when one of her students, a girl named Priya, who was 12 and perceptive in the specific, occasionally exhausting way of 12-year-olds who notice everything, looked at the small watercolor sketch pinned above Mia's desk, a morning light study she'd done from her own kitchen window, and said, "Did someone give you that?" "I made it," Mia said. Priya looked at it more carefully. "It looks happy." Mia looked at it too. It did look happy, she realized, not because of the subject, which was just a window and some light, but because of the quality of attention in it, the kind of attention you have when you're doing something ordinary in a life that feels good. "I was happy when I made it," she said. Priya nodded with the sage acceptance of someone filing information away. "It shows," she said, and went back to her own work. Mia stood in front of that sketch for a moment after, thinking about what it meant that happiness had become visible in the work she made. She was not a woman who needed the external confirmation. She knew what she felt. But there was something in Priya's observation that settled pleasantly, the recognition that the interior thing had made its way into what she produced, which was what happened when you weren't performing wellness, but actually occupying it. She had spent years, the years with Trevor, and honestly the years before Trevor, the long stretch of being the woman nobody quite noticed, performing a version of fine that was just contained enough to pass, smiling the right amount, not taking up too much space, carrying the awareness of her own body like a liability, a thing to manage rather than inhabit. She had dressed for subtraction, moved for invisibility, learned to hold herself in the poses that drew the least attention. She didn't do that anymore. She had not made a dramatic decision to stop. There had been no specific morning of resolution, no single conversation that unlocked it. It had eroded gradually, the performance replaced by something quieter and more solid, by a man who had moved his dinner plate across a room, by a child who had taken her hand without being asked, by the slow accumulation of being known and still wanted, which was the only evidence that actually moved anything in a person. She was not now without complexity. She still had mornings when the old voice surfaced, the one that cataloged and criticized and compared, and she still, on those mornings, had to consciously choose not to follow it into the spiral. That was not cured. It was managed, which was all that most things were. The difference was she had better tools now, and a life that made the spiraling less available because there was too much actual good in it to sustain the descent. That was not Ethan's doing. She was careful to understand. It was hers. He had contributed to the conditions, the specific consistent quality of being genuinely seen, but the work was always hers. She'd done it. She was still doing it. The relationship was not the medicine. She was the medicine. The relationship was the place she'd been healthy enough to receive. She pinned Priya's observation next to the sketch with an invisible note to herself and went back to grading. But the question came from Lily, as most significant things did, without warning or preamble, on a Wednesday morning in early December. They were at the kitchen table, Ethan, Mia, and Lily. The specific kind of breakfast that happened on the days Mia had stayed over and stayed through morning, which had become, without being formalized, a regular enough occurrence that Lily had stopped treating it as unusual. She was eating cereal with the focused solemnity she brought to most meals, feet swinging under the chair, when she looked up at Mia with the expression that meant something was coming. "Are you going to live here?" she asked. The question arrived in the kitchen the way questions from 5-year-olds arrived, completely unhedged, without social layer, just the pure thing. Ethan went very still over his coffee. Mia looked at Lily. "I have my own apartment, Bug." "I know." Lily stirred her cereal. "But you're here a lot." "I am a lot, yeah." "Jamie's mom lives with them," Lily said. Jamie was apparently a classmate whose domestic arrangements Lily tracked carefully. "And Tyler's mom doesn't. She lives somewhere else." "Lots of families are different," Mia said. Lily considered this. "Do you want to live here?" The kitchen was very quiet. Mia became aware that Ethan was watching her. Not urgently, not with any pressure in it, but with the careful attention he brought to things that mattered. He was not answering for her. He was not redirecting Lily. He was just present, watching, with an expression that she could not entirely read except that it was very open, which was unusual for him, which meant it was significant. "I really like being here," Mia said. "Is that okay?" Lily thought about it. "You could have the other closet," she said. "Daddy's closet is messy, but the other one isn't." Ethan made a sound that was not entirely a laugh. "That's very generous," Mia said. "You could put your brushes in it," Lily said, and returned to her cereal, apparently satisfied that the matter had been handled. Mia looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. Something passed between them. Not a decision, not yet, but the acknowledgement of a door that had been opened by a 5-year-old offering closet space in the most practical and least romantic way imaginable. "The other closet," Mia said. "She's not wrong that mine is messy," he said. "I've seen your closet." "Then you understand." She looked at the table, then back at him. "Is that something you'd want?" she asked. Quiet enough that Lily, focused on her cereal, wasn't part of it. He didn't answer immediately. He turned his coffee mug in his hands, which was his think gesture. She knew it by now. Then he looked at her with the directness he used when he'd come to the end of his processing and was ready to say the thing. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She held his gaze. She felt the specific, clean clarity that had become the signature feeling of decision she was making from the right place. Not from fear of losing something, not from the old pattern of fitting herself to the nearest available shape, from actual want, from the knowledge of what she was choosing and why. "Okay," she said. "Let's talk about it." Not about the closet specifically, not only about the closet, no. Lily looked up from her cereal. "Are you going to?" "We're going to think about it," Ethan said. Lily accepted this the way she accepted most things. Seriously, on her own terms. She looked at Mia. "You should bring your good brushes," she said, "not just the ones from your bag." "That is an excellent point," Mia said. Lily nodded. The matter was, in her assessment, progressing appropriately. She finished her cereal. They talked about it. Not that morning. That morning was just the opening of the door. They talked about it over the next several weeks, in the real way. The practical questions and the harder questions, and the questions that didn't have clean answers yet. Where would things go? What they'd tell Lily, and how. What it meant for her apartment lease. What it meant more broadly for the shape of what they were building. Ethan said, "I want to be clear that this isn't..." He stopped, started again. "I'm not asking this because it's the next logical step in some sequence. I'm asking because I want to wake up in the same place as you." She looked at him. He was terrible at romantic phrasing, and she had made peace with this very early on, because the romantic phrasing was not where his feeling lived. It lived in the moved dinner plate. The covered pot, the 11 minutes in the parking lot, and the way he'd learned the specific vocabulary of her needs without making her spell out every word. "I know why you're asking," she said. "Okay. And I want to." A pause. "I'm a little scared." "Of what specifically?" "Of what happens if it doesn't work." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair thing to be scared of." "Are you scared?" "Yeah," he said. No hesitation. "I'm scared every time I let anything matter. He looked at his hands. "I'm not letting the scared be the deciding thing anymore. I tried that for 4 years and I ended up alone on a balcony with one chair." She reached across and took his hand. He turned his palm up. "One chair," she said. "One chair," he confirmed. They moved her in on a Saturday in January, which was cold and unglamorous, and involved 3 trips in Ethan's truck and one argument about the correct way to wrap framed art for transport that Mia won on technical grounds. Lily participated by carrying things of negligible weight with tremendous ceremony and providing running commentary on what should go where. Sandra called in the middle of the 3rd trip, and Ethan answered on speaker while maneuvering a bookshelf, and Sandra's response to the news was simply, "It's about time," directed at no one in particular and everyone in general. Dave Hartley texted that evening. "Heard the news. Good man. She better than you?" Ethan texted back, "Significantly." Dave sent a thumbs up. That was the extent of the celebration on that front, which was exactly the right amount. By evening, the apartment had been rearranged into something that was neither his apartment nor hers, but a third thing. The specific domestic configuration that emerges when 2 people's objects and habits negotiate the same space. Her watercolors on the desk in the corner, his tools in the hall closet, Lily's drawings on the refrigerator, and now also on the wall above Mia's desk, because Lily had decided this was appropriate and Mia had agreed without argument. The second chair on the balcony was no longer the guest chair. It was just a chair. Both chairs were just chairs belonging to whoever sat in them. They ordered pizza because no one had the energy for anything else, and sat on the floor among boxes they hadn't unpacked yet, and Lily fell asleep against Mia's side somewhere between the first and second slice, the way she did sometimes, sudden and total, no warning, and Mia stayed very still so she wouldn't wake her, and Ethan looked at the 2 of them and felt something move through him that was large and quiet at once, the feeling of a life that had rearranged into the shape it was supposed to have. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He picked up another slice of pizza and let the evening be what it was. Spring came back around the way spring always did, insisting on itself after a winter that had seemed in January like it might simply decide to continue. The trees on Mia's teaching route came back first, a week before the warmth made it credible, which she always found optimistic in a way that she tried not to romanticize too much because she was a person who noticed these things and tried to use them correctly. Lily turned 5.5 and began negotiating fiercely for a pet, which Ethan refused on the grounds of their schedule and Mia supported on the grounds of educational value, and Lily leveraged this disagreement expertly over a period of 3 weeks until they arrived at a compromise. 1 fish, named by Lily before they'd even purchased it. "Gerald," Lily said. They had not yet been to the pet store. "You've decided the name?" Ethan said. "Gerald is a good name for a fish," Lily said, with great certainty. They got Gerald on a Saturday. He was a betta fish, blue and red, and he lived on the kitchen windowsill where the light was good and Lily could see him from the table. She took his care very seriously, consulting Mia on the specifics of betta fish welfare with the focused attention she brought to things she'd claimed ownership of. Gerald seemed, as much as a fish could seem anything, unbothered by the attention. He swam his small circuits with an equanimity that Ethan found, privately, admirable. Life organized itself around Gerald and Lily's school, and Ethan's shifts and Mia's classroom, and the Thursday evenings that remained theirs regardless of what the week required, because that was the promise they'd made, and they kept it. They kept it on the week Ethan's job ran to 6 days, and his hands hurt, and he came home already 3/4 used up. They kept it on the evening Mia had parent conferences until 7, and arrived tired and overtalked and just needed to sit somewhere without performing anything. They kept it because the keeping was the point. Because the decision to hold something against the pressure of ordinary life was not a romantic gesture, but a structural one, the kind that determines whether things last. They were not, even now, without their difficult weeks. Ethan went quiet in ways that still required patience from her, the internal processing that sometimes stretched longer than she'd like. The days when he came home with something in him that he hadn't found words for yet, and she had to resist the impulse to pull at it too quickly. She had learned to give it time, to say, "I'm here when you're ready," and then actually be there, not hovering, just available. And it always eventually came. Not always that night, sometimes the next day or in the car on the way somewhere, but it came. And she had her own difficult weeks, the ones when the old voice was louder than usual, when she stood in front of the mirror in the morning and felt the familiar weight of old assessments, the years of conditioning that did not evaporate because her circumstances improved. Those mornings still happened. She did not pretend they didn't. On those mornings, she was sometimes shorter than she meant to be, or she retreated slightly, or she needed a thing she couldn't clearly name and had to feel around for it. Ethan, on those mornings, did not try to fix it. He made coffee. He put it in the right mug. He said, "You okay?" And if she said not really, he said, "Okay," and stayed close without crowding. And eventually the morning passed into the kind of day where she could see more clearly again. He could not give her the clarity. She had to find it herself. But he had learned how to be the right kind of present while she did. They were learning each other constantly, in the way that two people who are actually paying attention learn each other. Not as fixed things, but as ongoing ones, as people who changed incrementally and required the continuous, gentle recalibration of genuine care. It was work. Nobody told you, beforehand, how much of it was just that. Work. Not the dramatic work of crises and confrontations, though those existed too. The daily, undramatic work of showing up as yourself to another person and asking them to do the same. The work of saying what you meant before it calcified into something harder. The work of maintaining the Thursday evenings, of covering the plate, of not letting the silence mean the wrong thing. That work was the thing. Not the beginning, not the falling, the daily labor of staying. Ethan understood this now in a way he hadn't before this year. He had come into this, if he was being honest, with a fairly defended position, responsible, reliable, present for his daughter, capable of caring and terrified of the cost of it. He had kept himself in the practical tier for years because the practical tier was the one where the ground stayed solid. He knew how to manage a utility line in an ice storm. He did not know, for a long time, how to stand in a kitchen and say, "I've been falling in love with you," and let the ground be uncertain. He knew now. Not because certainty had arrived. Certainty was never really the thing he'd come to understand. The ground was always slightly uncertain. The point was learning to stand on it anyway, to choose the thing that mattered enough to stand for, and then to keep standing. He stood in the utility yard one afternoon in late April, end of shift, peeling off his gloves, and looked up at the sky. It was the same blue as September had been, but warmer in it, the blue of spring rather than fall. Below it, the ordinary yard. Around him, the ordinary end-of-shift sounds. In an hour he'd be home. Mia would probably be there. Lily would have opinions about dinner. Gerald would be swimming his circuits on the kitchen windowsill. The apartment would be full of the specific, unremarkable noise of a life that was occupied by people who were glad to be in it. That was the whole of it. The whole of what he'd almost driven away from in a parking lot on a Saturday afternoon the year before, because he was tired and certain he didn't have the bandwidth for anything new. The whole of what had been waiting inside an ordinary wedding that two people attended on technicalities. He had almost not walked in. She had almost stayed in her apartment. They had both arrived on the thinnest margins of yes, and from those margins had built this, incrementally, imperfectly, with full knowledge of each other's limitations and the clear-eyed decision to stay anyway. There was, he thought, something worth saying about that. About the way the most significant things in a life arrive not in the form of obvious opportunities, but in the small, easy-to-miss doorways. The wedding you almost skip, the table you almost don't approach, the thing you almost don't say because you've talked yourself into waiting. The moments that look, from the outside, like nothing. That feel, in the middle of them, like nothing much. He thought about the version of himself who had sat in that truck and held his keys and run the calculations of what it would cost to go home. He thought about that man with some tenderness. The tired, defended, careful man who had been carrying everything alone for so long that alone had started to feel like personality rather than circumstance. He didn't judge him. He understood him. He just wasn't him anymore, or wasn't only him, which was maybe the more accurate way to say it. He put his gloves in his bag. He got in his truck. He drove home. The balcony by late April held 2 chairs and a small table that Mia had found at an estate sale in February and declared structurally sound. On the table, there was usually a coffee mug belonging to one or both of them, and sometimes a book belonging to Mia, and occasionally a drawing belonging to Lily that had been brought outside for review and then abandoned. The chairs were not matched. They'd come from different sources, different periods of Ethan's life and Mia's, and they didn't look like a set. They looked like what they were. 2 things that had ended up in the same place and stayed. It was a Wednesday in late April when they were both out there, the evening light doing its spring thing through the neighborhood, Lily inside watching the one allowed episode of her current animated fixation, Gerald visible through the glass of the kitchen window from where they sat. Mia had her feet on the railing. Ethan had his coffee. Neither of them was saying much because the not saying had become, over months, one of the better things between them. The permission to simply be in the same space without filling it. "Hey," Mia said. He looked at her. "I was thinking about something one of my students said." She turned her coffee mug. "She said my painting looked happy, that it showed." "Your painting from the kitchen window?" "Yeah." She paused. "I kept thinking about that, about how what you feel ends up in what you make, whether you intend it to or not." He considered this. "That tracks. I've made a lot of things this year," she said, "and they all look different from the things I made before." She looked at him. "I don't think it's because I'm better technically. I think it's because I'm—" She stopped, looking for the right word. "Present in a different way, less occupied with something I'm trying not to show." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to manage yourself around me," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the thing." She turned back to the neighborhood, the evening, the ordinary view that had become their ordinary view. "I know." He reached across and touched her hand. She turned her palm up, their gesture established without being established, just the way their hands found each other. "Mia." She looked at him. He had been carrying something for the last 3 weeks, so not anxiously, not with the old fearful quiet, but with the deliberate patience of a man who was waiting for the right moment, rather than the moment that fear had closed off. He'd thought about it carefully, which was his way. He'd looked at it from every practical angle, which was also his way. He'd arrived at his conclusion through the process he always used, which was to look at the evidence as honestly as he could and then decide what the evidence said. The evidence said this. He reached into his jacket pocket. He'd been keeping it there for 3 days, waiting, and set it on the small table between them. It was a simple thing, a ring, not elaborate, the kind he'd chosen because it looked like her, quiet and specific and more beautiful the longer you looked at it. She looked at it, then at him. "I'm not doing the kneeling thing," he said. "Okay," she said, "because it seems like the kind of thing where the gesture becomes the point, and that's not—" "Ethan." "Yeah." "Stop talking and ask me." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the unguarded face, the version of her that wasn't managing anything, and her eyes were doing the bright thing, and the evening light was behind her, and the neighborhood was doing its ordinary evening things, and it was all exactly as imperfect and specific and right as everything else had been. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said, immediately, without a single moment of deliberation, because she'd done her deliberating months ago in the same quiet way he had. In the accumulation of Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sunday mornings, in every ordinary moment that had added up to a life she wanted to stay inside. He put the ring on her hand. It didn't go on quite right the first time. He misjudged the angle slightly, had to adjust, and she laughed at that, the escaped real laugh, and he did too. And it was not a cinematic moment, but it was a real one, which was always what they'd been. She held her hand up and looked at the ring in the evening light. "It's beautiful," she said. "It looked like you," he said. She lowered her hand and looked at him with the expression she'd made that first night at the wedding when he'd asked her to dance, That thing between suspicion and warmth, except now it was mostly just warmth. The suspicion long since replaced by the evidence of months. She leaned across the space between the chairs and kissed him, and he held her face the same way he always did, careful and deliberate, like something he intended to keep doing for a long time. Inside, the episode ended. Lily appeared at the sliding door. "What are you doing?" she asked. They looked at her. "We have something to tell you," Ethan said. Lily came out onto the balcony. She looked at Mia's hand. She looked at her father. She looked at Mia. "Is Mia gonna be my—" She stopped, working through the word. "Stepmom?" "If that's okay with you," Mia said. Lily thought about it with the gravity she brought to important things. Then she looked at Mia's ring again. "Does this mean you're really not leaving?" she said. Something in the question, the specific unvarnished 5-year-old's version of the real question, moved through both of them. "I'm really not leaving," Mia said. Lily looked at her for another moment. Then she climbed onto Mia's lap, which she did sometimes with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who has decided someone belongs to her and settled in, facing outward toward the neighborhood, Mia's arms coming around her. Ethan looked at the two of them. The evening, the mismatched chairs, Gerald swimming somewhere behind the glass. He thought about the parking lot, the 11 minutes, the wedding he had almost not walked into. He thought about a woman rearranging an evening bag at a table at the edge of a room, trying to be invisible, not knowing that someone was already walking toward her. He thought about the whole long year of it, the coffee shops and the Sunday walks, and the argument about frame wrapping and the covered plate and the Thursday evenings held firm. The daily, imperfect, entirely real work of building something that mattered with another person who was willing to do the work alongside you. There were things he hadn't understood before this year. That the life you want doesn't announce itself. It shows up sideways in parking lots and wedding receptions, in the middle of the ordinary week, wearing the face of something you almost talked yourself out of. That loneliness, held long enough, starts to feel like character, like this is simply who you are. A person who carries things alone, a person for whom the full life is someone else's story. That you can be wrong about that. That the evidence, if you look at it honestly, says something different. He had looked at the evidence. He had walked through the door. Everything since had been the result of that one small, barely made decision. The one made not from courage or hope, but from the most modest possible motivation. He had already said he was on his way, and Ethan Walker did not go back on what he said. Out of that, all of this. He thought there was something worth knowing in that. Something about how the heroic entry point to the rest of your life is rarely heroic. It's usually just the parking lot you sat in long enough. The door you opened anyway. The hand you reached for across the impractical distance of a round table at the back of a room where everyone else was dancing. And this too, that the woman sitting alone at that table had her own version of the same courage. Had said yes to a wedding she didn't want to attend. Had answered a door at 7:43 in the morning with her hair half done and given the conversation everything it asked for. Had walked into a coffee shop and held her own ground and left on her own terms. And been honest enough, when it mattered, to say it's not the whole truth. Had done the quiet, unwitnessed work of becoming the person who could be here. Had done it herself, through her own persistence, long before he was part of the picture. He had noticed her, but she had already been worth noticing. Those were different things, and only one of them was hers. Lily shifted on Mia's lap, reaching forward to point at something in the street below. A dog, from the shape of it, doing something ridiculous that Lily was narrating with increasing animation. Mia's chin came down to rest on Lily's head. Ethan watched them both and did not say anything, because nothing needed to be said. Some things you just let exist without language, knowing that the language would diminish them. The evening went on. Dinner happened because it always did. The practical machinery of a life continuing. Lily's bath. The book. Still frog and toad. Still for the 1000th time. The light under her door going out. The apartment settling into its night sounds. And then, later, the balcony again. 2 chairs. The neighborhood quiet. The ring on Mia's hand catching the light from inside. They talked about small things and then stopped talking and just stayed out there until it was actually late, and the sensible thing was to go in, and even then neither of them moved immediately. both of them occupying the moment with the deliberate appreciation of people who have learned what it costs to almost miss it. This was the life neither of them had thought to want, or, more accurately, the life both of them had quietly, privately wanted for years, without believing it was the kind of thing that would happen to them. The ordinary version of extraordinary. The apartment with the mismatched chairs, the 5-year-old who stirred the pasta, the fish on the windowsill, the ring that didn't go on quite right the first time. Not perfect, not the version that comes without difficulty or work, or the occasional week that requires more patience than either person feels they have. Just real, just theirs, just enough, and more than enough, and everything.